Morning everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I think the majority of people who subscribed are on the webinar now, and so in the interest of time I think we'll get started. Firstly, welcome and thank you for attending this webinar. This is a standalone webinar on digitalisation and its impact on software testing. This webinar, it's the same content that I presented at a seminar of the same name that we held in London back in early May 2018. And the feedback we received from the people that weren't able to attend on the day is that they'd quite like to be able to sort of view the content and to view the presentation offline. So this webinar is as a result of those requests. So a little bit about me. I'm Ash Gawthorpe, one of the co-founders of Ten10, with my background being in hardware and software engineering, development and architecture, with experience in technical testing and performance testing specifically. In the interest of time, we'll be pursuing this at some pace. If you don't quite understand part of it, the webinar will be available for download at a later date, so you'll be able to essentially stream it and to review it again if you need to. On that note, if you have a question, please enter it in the chat window that you should see there on your screen. If we don't get a chance to answer those today, then we will make sure that we respond to every question that we're asked individually. Firstly, we'll be looking at the digital landscape in 2018 and beyond, and just some key trends there. We'll then be exploring why software testing is more important than ever in this ever-changing digital world, and a little bit around the risks of not doing it. We'll then be looking at the trends within the software testing industry, and finally we'll be looking at pulling it all together and working out what's required to create a successful and coherent digital test strategy in order to mitigate against the risks that we see and that we will be exploring as we go through. For the first part then, this is really around the opportunities, threats, challenges, and to provide you with some background info. So if we look at this slide here around digitalisation around the world, what we can see here, I mean, there's some truly big numbers here. So 7.5 billion people in the world, with over half of them, 53%, having access to the internet. Of that 53%, over 3 billion people with an active social media footprint. And what's interesting here is that over 5 billion unique mobile users, over 2/3 of the world with a mobile device, and 93% of active social media users are using their mobile phones to do it. If we go on to share of traffic by devices or device type, the key message for me here is that less than half the world's web traffic is now served to laptops and desktops, with interestingly, a 17% increase in the traffic from other devices. So not mobile phones, not tablets, but in the example there it shows a games controller. So those devices can be a combination of games consoles, smart TVs, IoT devices, wearables, a whole host of things which users use to interact with, but which don't have a traditional screen or a keyboard. Now that presents, it can be done, but it presents some interesting testing challenges, particularly around automation. So we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail a little later on. What I think is also interesting here on this slide is the year-on-year decrease in tablets. Now, my take on that is that as many smartphones now have HD resolution screens, or greater resolution than that, you're able to do a lot of things on your phone that I think a year or so ago would really have been more likely to be done on a tablet device. So I think we've often removed that step, and that can now just simply be done on a mobile. This slide's interesting in terms of how users are accessing content across the spread between desktop, mobile, and multi-platform. And really, this slide is just essentially showing most of the countries are split roughly equally, with the lion's share showing multi-platform access. So there's no real sort of trends or split by different region type and that largely the lion's share of people are using different platforms in order to access and interact with content. And if we look at this slide here, this really does show the incredible growth in mobile traffic over the years, essentially. And it looks like it's leveling off a little bit, but I think we're just going to still continue to see mobile having the lion's share of traffic as more and more users start to do things that once upon a time were considered that they needed to be done on a desktop or on a laptop device. In terms of how the share of mobile web is shared by operating system, I mean this does tell a story here, almost sort of 80-20 rule stuff between Android and iOS, with the remainder there largely kind of on the decline. What I would say is that this really varies by region, and that part of a successful sort of digital testing strategy is really knowing your customer base and the spread of OS and actually device type that have been accessed by your users, and sort of adjusting your budget and your focus accordingly. So in some regions it's almost entirely Android, and in other regions we see far higher percentage of access through iOS. The average then is around 80 apps installed on the phone, with half the apps used each month, on average for 2 hours. So interestingly, of that time, 7 times more time is spent using native apps rather than web apps. I think this is a throwback to some of the conversations that were happening a number of years ago. Particularly, I think Facebook has, in their view of, when they said essentially they weren't really going to continue with the mobile web platform, they were just going all out native as a result of the sort of usability and the performance benefits. And I think we're really seeing that kind of come through there, with finally mobile native apps being used 13 times more than web apps. So what there isn't here, however, is a view of how hybrid apps factor into this. So where you have an app which under the bonnet is essentially a web app, but instead of it being accessed via a mobile browser, or at least explicitly accessed via that browser, it appears on the App Store, it's downloaded as a native app, it appears on the phone as a native app, but under the bonnet it's using HTML, JavaScript, CSS to actually process that content. And if we just move on to the next one here, what we can see is the slide with the value of global consumer spending on mobile. As you can see, some really huge numbers here. I mean, the one in the middle just captures your attention with £86 billion, and the growth, 100% growth of global consumer spend on mobile apps, and just the importance of this, I think is just going to continue and keep increasing. So we just have a few slides here around why do we need to test, and I mean we just pulled a few stories here that kind of made the national press essentially, but what I think the trends we're seeing here is that these tend to be digital apps that are talking to complex, often legacy back-end systems, with sort of very high value sort of interactions going through them. So mobile banking platforms, HMRCs, self-assessment tax return portal. And when these things are going wrong and they make the national news, these don't tend to be small issues. These aren't kind of small usability issues or compatibility issues. These are fundamental failures in the core functionality of the application. If a mobile banking platform is able to show not just your transactions but somebody else's, or if you pay money into a particular account, it's paying the wrong account, that's a fairly fundamental failing of that deployment process and also the software testing that was done on it. Just going to take a look at some of the software testing trends that we kind of see here, and some of the reasons for digitalization and some of the trends around that. So if we just look at the slide here, which talks about the drivers for application transformation, and what's interesting for me is how much deploy new applications, how far down that is down the list. The lion's share of the activities here are around improving and migrating existing functionality and offering it to users in different ways on mobile platforms, but also as a means of consolidating existing legacy applications. So taking a large number of legacy apps and consolidating those into fewer applications, but also taking the opportunity to migrate applications from traditional on-prem architecture to the cloud, or also migrate away from enterprise packaged software to a SaaS offering. And I think that's kind of quite interesting when you take that as a whole. That we're not talking about necessarily about driving new applications and new functionality into the hands of users. A lot of it is around taking existing functionality, repackaging it, replatforming it, and presenting it to users in different ways. We can't really talk about this without talking about Agile and DevOps, always and ever present. Every client that we speak to at least has aspirations to move to DevOps. Some of those clients are some way down that journey and reasonably mature. Some of them are really just starting out. And for some of them, it might not be appropriate, or indeed if they're even able to move to a process where the application is continuously deployed, maybe due to regulatory reasons or for some other reasons. But what they all want to do is to move to a position where they are always able to have deployable software that's ready to go, and that the decision on when they do go live with something is in their hands, rather than it being stacked up behind a whole host of features and functionality and the code not being in a deployable state. So in terms of test automation, what I'd say here is that test automation can work well and can provide some real business benefits if it's done well. But if it's done badly, using the wrong tools against the wrong applications at the wrong time, in the wrong phase of development, then it has the potential to turn into a real money pit, which isn't really adding much value. Also, Ten10 believe that the most effective testing comes from using the right blend of people and machines working well together. So getting people to do what they're best at, which is around spotting patterns and changes and unusual activity, and determining themselves if that's wrong or it's unexpected, and leaving machines to do what they're best at, which is running repetitive tasks where there's a very clear outcome, and being able to run those consistently, accurately, and at scale very quickly. But what I would say is that our view sort of concurs with the market view on this, and that an increase in investment in automation is a good thing. If we look at the next slide here, it depends on the type of testing. And in this slide, I think the devil's in the detail. I think there's some complexity behind the scenes here. If by manual testing, that they're referring to manually running through scripted tests because it's not viable for one reason or another to automate it, then it's less effective. But if by manual testing, they're talking about exploratory testing, so kicking up a large number of defects through having skilled, experienced testers doing what they're best at, then I feel that that's far, far more optimum. This is interesting around, for web apps, the way in which testing is conducted on different browser types. So 90% test on more than one browser, which is great, but I'm slightly concerned around the 10% that don't. And what I'm really hoping here is that the majority of that 10% are only testing on one browser, because the application that they're developing is an internal system, perhaps an enterprise system that's rolled out on a sort of corporate desktop image. And so through that, they enforce the use of a single browser rather than they are just testing it on a single browser type. And in terms of how you perform that testing across a range of real devices or simulators, emulators, we can see here that 77% are using a mix of real devices and emulators. Is clearly wider adoption of both types, and also adoption of cloud-based services from the likes of Source Labs, Browser Stack, Perfecto Mobile, to give you access to a wider range of devices. We find that that's very useful, and we do that ourselves to sort of for compatibility testing on the range of devices. But you should never use that sort of remote access solution as a substitute for doing testing with the actual device in your hand, to be able to test that and just really feel how the app's performing, and how that user experience sort of is reflected in an actual device. In terms of focus areas within testing, we can see here that there's a move towards efficiency, performance testing, and also that user experience and ease of use testing also being a key driver, as opposed to functionality. We can see there that I think that's just almost a given. What I think we're seeing here is that the other sort of facets and variables that mobile brings to this, in terms of how it does perform, how that user experience is on mobile networks and a range of devices with different capabilities, that's becoming more and more important and more of a focus, and rightly so. In terms of what's required in a tester, so we can see here that there's a move from that sort of traditional tester. We see the skill set required on a spectrum, with sort of good test analysis skills at one end, with good strong technical skills, including application development, as well as expertise in the actual specific domain, being at the other end. And where people sort of see themselves on that spectrum, I think varies, but there needs to be recognition that it is there, and that people need to be able to do a little bit of everything. I think the days are gone when you had somebody who would say, well, I just work with a GUI, essentially. Even if we have somebody that is performing that, maybe say an exploratory testing role on an application with a GUI, we would expect them to be able to do things like log on to a particular machine and grep a log file to see that an entry's appeared, and that it's something that they've done in the front end has propagated through, or maybe to query a database to be able to check that the table entry's been updated, or something like that, kind of bringing it together in a more sort of holistic fashion, rather than it just being all about the GUI. And if we actually look into this in a bit more detail, this is kind of how we see sort of the different trends and the different sort of levels of adoption in software testing. You can review this in your own time, really. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but we are seeing a skills shortage in terms of what's required now in a good, strong tester. Because we're asking a lot, really. We're asking people that can communicate clearly with stakeholders, that are able to speak to the business, that are good technically, that have good analytical skills, but that also understand the domain as well. And when you bring all that together, coupled with the fact that the tools that we're using, the software that's been developed is also in a state of flux, and one of the key things that we also feel is essential is that aptitude and hunger for learning, essentially, and to learn new skills and to constantly improve, rather than saying this is a tool that I know and that's all I know, and I'll stick with that tool and won't do anything else. The only constant is change, really. So in summary then, that user experience and performance is absolutely key. And as well as that, the drivers are there, implemented in parallel with a number of initiatives, including migration of on-prem infrastructure to cloud, and also that migration to potentially from an enterprise software package to more of a SaaS offering. And then that mantra of automation appropriate, where appropriate, with machines doing what they're good at and people doing what they're good at. And when you bring those two together in the right blend, according to the requirements that you have for your particular application types, and that becomes very powerful. And finally, that testing on a variety of platforms, physical, emulator, simulator, cloud. If it's a web app, then please do test on the variety of different browsers out there, but also look at what your users are using. Look at the stats that you have around what percentage of different browser types are being used where, and focus your testing budget accordingly in line with that to reflect that. So this part deals with the key considerations and an approach, or at least a suggested approach, for building and delivering a digital test strategy. So digital doesn't necessarily mean mobile, but for a lot of our clients, for the reasons I mentioned earlier around the uptake and the complexity mobile can add, and particularly other mobile devices that aren't a mobile, a tablet, or a desktop or laptop. They add numerous extra dimensions and levels of complexity, which a lot of organizations are taking time to adapt to and to react to those challenges that's required in order to test them. So we're going to look at a few points here. So firstly, which mobile features are in scope for testing, and then what types of testing need to be in scope and where the focus should be. We're then going to look at the practicalities of how you define and maintain the devices, the OS and browser combinations that you need to test, how you introduce new ones, crucially how you end of life and sort of drop off the old ones as they disappear, and then how you define that in an approach, and finally how you can bring automation into that as well to get the most value from it, where and if it's appropriate and at what time. So I think I mentioned it before that this idea that customer experience is absolutely key. So that's a combination of web, it's a combination of mobile, it's a combination of social media, and the fact that a single user journey nowadays can span multiple channels. So you need to be fully aware of that as well. If a transaction or something starts on a particular device, it doesn't mean to say it's going to conclude on that same platform or that same type. And then that move from functional validation to customer experience validation. This for me is really clear. One of the givens we have here is that functionally the application is working the way that you expect it to. But the key message here is more how well does it work, not just in terms of how easy it is to use, how usable it is to use, how it works across a wide variety of devices with different levels of performance and different capabilities and different screen resolutions, and then bringing all that together into this kind of hybrid functional testing and non-functional testing model, cutting across channels and technologies. One of the challenges we find is that the user perception and the user expectation is that they expect a mobile app, perhaps if you're on a train doing 100 miles an hour across the length of the country, but they expect the interactivity and the responsiveness to be pretty much the same as if you were sat in an office with a desktop with wired Ethernet. Obviously, it can't be there. If you lose connection, you lose connection. But what's important is that that feedback is provided to the user, and that when connection is restored, the application picks up as seamlessly as it can, and that customer experience is as seamless as it can be, and the customer is kept constantly informed. And then in terms of the complexity, we're increasingly seeing multiple applications built on multiple platforms, built with different technologies. Sometimes those are standalone or just maybe interfacing to a large number of third-party APIs and interfaces. Often, though, they are integrating with a back-end legacy, sometimes even mainframe system, which can cause all kinds of challenges, particularly around test environments and managing those, and deployment timescales when you have the front end, which is normally created in a sort of agile-esque iterative development model, facing off to this back-end system that's maybe deployed and developed in a much more sort of that sort of two-speed model with more of a sort of waterfall quarterly release cycle, much slower view in terms of updates and in terms of rollout. And so to help that, you can look to bring in things like service virtualization, where a lot of those third parties are virtualized. So for your testing, you have control of them and you're not having to bring this enormous and complex environment with you just in order to be able to test some front-end changes, for example. And using those automation tools for testing, obviously, but crucially also leveraging what you have for data creation, management of that data. Testing often will modify a lot of data, destroy the data, create new data. If you're running your tests, you want to be able to take it back to that sort of Groundhog Day effect, which you can maybe do through restoring the database, or you maybe find yourself able to do that through running a set of automated scripts on it to sort of cleanse and reset the data. And then finally, that kind of risk-based approach to provide the right blend of effort and coverage without exposing unnecessary risk. Now, this is very, very key to the key drivers and the key sort of sensitivities for the application you're developing. For example, it may be an application, a retail application, where it's very important that the customer experience is good, that the usability, a lot of effort has gone into that, and that it works in a variety of platforms. Maybe it doesn't need to be quite so resilient. If you have a mobile banking application, then your primary focus is going to be around ensuring that the application works in the way that you expect it to, and that if you are halfway through moving money from one account to another, and then you do lose connection, that connection is restored seamlessly, that upon reconnection the user is informed and it states exactly what position it's in and whether they want to move forward or roll it back. So a different focus and a different set of priorities. So this next slide is an interesting one. When we work with clients, often they have a mobile app, but the question is often just how many features of that actual mobile device they're using. Sometimes it's the case that it's really like a desktop application, but just without the keyboard and mouse. And so if we look at this in a little bit of detail here, and what we can see is that the first thing we need to consider is that desktop application, or mobile delivered sort of desktop type app, where you are interacting with the screen, entering text in text boxes, scrolling up and down through pages, clicking on buttons, but essentially a desktop app without the keyboard, without the mouse. The next thing to then consider are some of the differences between that mobile and desktop experience. Now, you obviously have considerations around the network. It could be that your mobile app is using the Wi-Fi network, and that could be a very, very quick Wi-Fi network. There may be scenarios where the coverage isn't great, and that needs to be taken into account, and you need to keep the customer informed around the sort of the status of that. It might be it's using mobile networking, which can obviously be very, very variable, and the application should be tested on a variety of simulated different networks just to see what that user experience is like and how it performs and how it responds. Power is an interesting one, because this is often just taken for granted. If you have a desktop application or a desktop system or a laptop even, you have a significant amount of power available there. In the case of desktop, it's largely infinite. It's not with a mobile device, and if you are doing things like if you're using the wireless inefficiently, if perhaps you're heart beating regularly to an application, then that wireless will never really power down, so it's always on, and that will chew through the battery. And with everybody so reliant nowadays on their mobile devices, what that means is that if your app is seen to be chewing through the battery very, very quickly, then that has quite a negative impact on users. And the fact that they're so reliant on the phones means that your app is essentially really, really curtailing their ability to carry on and do everything else they need to do. So that needs to be carefully measured and carefully monitored. And the stopwatch on there represents just performance. If you consider Android devices, for example, you can go into a shop and spend £50 on an Android phone, or you can go in and spend £800,000 on a phone. Those two devices, whilst in theory they're running the same operating system, they have hugely different capability and hugely different performance characteristics. And so it's important that you test at both ends of the spectrum to check that user experience is still strong. And also the thing to bear in mind here is that you may have a £1,000 phone today, which is very, very quick, but if you keep hold of it for a few years, the performance will then drop off relatively in comparison to what a £300 phone is doing in the market. So that needs to be carefully thought out in terms of the strategy. We then come on to some of the other more mobile features, truly mobile features of the app. So the microphone, for example, location services, the camera, the speaker, the accelerometer. How are these used? and how are you testing those? There are ways to test location services, so you're able to essentially spoof your location and test what happens if you're driving along or if you're going down the road. If your application uses the microphone, then you need the ability to be able to play through a number of sound samples into that as part of the testing. But you also need to consider things like background noise as well and how well it responds and reacts to that. What I would say is that the lion's share of customers that we have, they're really focused on the inner circle and the next one out. We tend to see fewer applications where they're using all the features of a mobile application. And if you think about the types of testing that are in scope here, so clearly we have functional testing of the core functionality. Now that's testing across a representative combination of devices, as we mentioned before, using real devices, but also simulators, emulators to expand that coverage if you don't have the real devices, and also through using cloud-based services there as well. And this is a combination of automation and human-driven exploratory sort of session-based testing, bringing the two things together. And when you combine those two, it becomes quite powerful. And also, if you have it, and if your application uses it to think about some of those mobile-specific functions like the microphone, like the accelerometer. And if we think about the functional cross-platform testing that's required here, so compatibility testing to ensure that it works in a variety of different devices with a variety of different OS versions and browser combinations on different devices with different pixel densities, different screen resolutions. Need to be mindful of accessibility testing. How well does it work with screen readers, for example? Does it meet those accessibility standards? And to test, and if required, to get that accreditation there. And then finally, usability testing. How well does the application work? How contrived are some of those user journeys? Can they be optimized? Can they be reviewed? And there are sort of fairly standard practices and guidelines to sort of to consider in order for all these things, really. But they're very, very important, and particularly the last one, because if you think back 10, 20 years, if you had an application and you weren't very happy with it, the activation energy required for you to swap to a different provider and to use their offering was pretty tough. If indeed there was another option. Nowadays, you're probably 30 seconds to a minute away from being able to download, register, and start using a competitor's product offering potentially very similar services to your own, and that can be quite dangerous if the usability isn't spot on and users are becoming frustrated trying to perform some activity on your application. I think we touched on this before, but around non-functional testing, you want to be measuring those user response times on a variety of devices with varying sort of horsepower and capability. This can be as complex as you want it to be. It can be instrumented on automated functional tests that you might have, or it might be as simple as just sitting there with a stopwatch and just kind of understanding that difference. So doing that on different devices, but then repeating that process on different simulated networks, essentially. So you're understanding your app's sensitivity to bandwidth restrictions, increases in latency, packet loss. And then one point that's often overlooked but provides some real benefits is the analysis of that traffic that's uploaded and downloaded. One thing we're seeing is as application development becomes more abstracted from the underlying nuts and bolts of the infrastructure and the devices that you're writing software for, some of the old school ways of looking at things in terms of how many messages am I passing, what's the payload size of those messages, is it efficient? That can be often overlooked. And so just by using some tools like Charles Proxy or something similar to that, and just observing how much data is going backwards and forwards, how many round trips are you making? If you're pulling all that data back, do you need it? If you do need it, are you caching it or are you getting it again? Very, very simple and very effective means of significantly improving performance, and something we find that's often overlooked. I mentioned before the effective use of wireless there and its impact on power consumption. And finally, and this is something that we see that is very often overlooked, is that connection dropout, loss testing, and understanding how the application recovers, and its impact on the user experience at that point. Does it just pick up where it left off, or does it drop you back into some earlier part of the transaction, which then makes it very frustrating for the user? The next point here is then just thinking about how to maintain that matrix of device, OS, if it's a web app, the browser combination as well, and how you maintain that device list. And so you need to be mindful of new devices as they appear on the market. You need to be mindful of new OS versions as they come down the line, mindful of new browser versions as they come down the line, but equally important, it's about removing the older versions as you see your user base level of use of those different combinations start to drop off. Then you need to consider end-of-lifing those from your tests and bringing new things in. And so really it boils down to these kind of combinations based on the application type, whether it's native, hybrid, or web, the supported OSs, whether it's iOS, Android, Windows, and also that device usage and the specific devices that are used there. Identify the key ones, make sure that you focus testing effort on those, with then some sort of lighter touch exploratory testing on some of the other less used combination. And the thing to bear in mind here is that if you're an application vendor and you're building your own apps, you're no longer sort of in control of everything. There are new versions of the operating system, new versions of the browser which can be pushed on you. And if your application doesn't work with those, and the first you hear about it is when users start complaining about it, and depending on the type of app you're developed, that App Store accreditation process can then become very hard. So even if you've identified a fix for it there and then, it's a period of time before it's then into the hands of your users and they're able to use it again. So if you think about how you sort of combine this in an approach, I think I touched on it just a couple of minutes ago, but you have this sort of window, if you like, which moves over time. So that window consists of a full regression test on a variety of your sort of commonly used combinations, with then far more tests being run on a different wider variety of devices, which are those kind of session-based exploratory testing on, in the example we've shown here, 10 times the number of combinations. And it's about being mindful of the CPU, GPU performance test, sort of low and high, network performance test, low and high, the screen res, low res screens, high res screens, and how you kind of bring those together. You're not doing the full functional depth of testing here. You're not checking that the application sort of functionally meets its requirements. That's been done at another point. This is more checking that it all comes together and still works well on a particularly cheap Android device on a fairly constrained network, for example. It's those boundary tests and establishing what is acceptable to the users. And there's a few other things you probably want to consider around operational acceptance tests. So for example, backup and restoration, data clear down. What happens if your user's on version X of the operating system and then they skip a couple of upgrades, for example? What happens if you're taking a call while the application's running and you're halfway through it? Network tasks, recovery following connection loss, switching from wireless to Wi-Fi and back again, and also assessing that volume of traffic up and down. I'm just going to touch briefly on automation here, and just some of what we consider to be sort of the best practices around it, really. So I guess the core principle here is that we consider code to be code, whether it's code for actually writing the application or it's code to test the application. So good practices like abstraction, reuse, encapsulation, that needs to be carefully considered. Close collaboration with development and vendor teams is really, really important. You'll find, and we've encountered scenarios where automation engineers have been really banging their heads against the desk trying to overcome a problem, which is quite contrived and quite difficult. But with a chat with the development team, it's often possible to make that far easier, perhaps to detect an element or detect the absence of an element or something else. And by doing that and having that good working relationship and that trust, you're reducing maintenance, you're reducing script development time, and then off the back of that, what you're doing is increasing robustness and increasing the effectiveness of that automated regression suite. Final point here. Automation is great, as I mentioned before, if done well and if done at the right time, but there has to be a healthy amount of pragmatism in terms of this. Whenever you're writing a test or automated test, always think of it in terms of you're building a sort of a building technical debt here. You're building something which has to be maintained. If you need to write while you're writing 10 tests, if you can get away with 2 or 3 tests, constantly think about that. You think about that investment that you're placing in automation and carefully consider the ROI. If you have a number of apps, really look at the ones where you're going to get the maximum bang for your buck, considering application reuse, the level of change, technical complexity, and how all this comes together. So the key considerations here then for automation, is your app developed in-house by yourselves and your own development teams, or is it provided by an external vendor? If it is provided by an external vendor, do you have access to the source code, or do you have control over the build process? There are different automation tools and different approaches to automation, and the one that you use largely depends on your access to that build process, which you have to build in libraries, or you have to define devices that you want to test it with, all of which can be quite constraining. And if you don't have a close working relationship and the ability to modify and to build those in, then that's going to be very, very hard for you. How often does that application change? Is it in a constant state of flux? Do the development team have a habit of recreating all the automation IDs and resetting them and changing them with each release, for example? And then finally, you think about piloting an automation project on a particular app with a small number of scripts, but I would say a representative amount of functionality still, but using a variety of tools, and really ensuring that that tool does work with your actual application, and not with perhaps a vendor's application, or if it's an open source tool with a sort of sample site or a sample app that it was created using. The right tool for your application may not be the one that you consider first of all, and it's only really when the rubber hits the road and you start using it in anger on your own app that you'll start to see some of those challenges and some of those nuances. Okay, so apologies, I think I've run slightly over here, but I hope that's been useful. As ever, if you do have any questions, feel free to fire those in. I think there have been a couple, so we'll take a look at those, and obviously we'll answer those individually and directly back to the people that have asked them. And so really, I think it just remains for me to say thank you very much for attending this session today. I hope it's been useful, and we will, in the next day or two, be making this webinar available for streaming from the website. So I appreciate I have rattled over this a little bit quickly, so sort of points that maybe you've missed, you'll have the opportunity to revisit it then. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much for attending, and to hope you have a good day. Thanks very much. Bye.